All right, welcome back. So today our question is going to be, why did Brigham Young create the racial priesthood ban? So to review from last episode, we talked about a few claims from individuals that Joseph Smith created the priesthood ban during his time before his death. However, we were able to prove that these claims were incorrect based off of non-contemporary sources from individuals like Zebedee Coltrane. These documents serve to link the priesthood ban to Joseph Smith. However, there's no legitimate contemporary proof that this ever happened. Therefore, we're left with the question of, if not Joseph Smith, then who? And we know that who. We'll talk about that today. It's going to be Brigham Young. And then the question goes to, why did Brigham Young create the racial priesthood ban? For this episode, we're really going to focus on two reasons. One is going to be fear of miscegenation, or the intermarriage of blacks and whites, interracial marriage. And the second is going to be fear of losing Southern support for the church. These two reasons really come together on February 4th, 1852. It's at this time that Brigham Young is going to introduce what's known as an act in relation to service. And this is going to be the day before the actual priesthood ban is going to be announced, February 5th of 1852. But if we look closer at the February 4th document, it tells us a lot about what's going on in Brigham Young's mind and in the Utah Territory. This document, it sets the territory's laws regarding slavery. That's the main purpose of an act in relation to service. And if we look at many of the states, albeit eliminate most of the northern states who are eliminating slavery, filled with abolitionists at the time. But if we look at southern states who are supportive of slavery, and we look at Utah, the Utah Territory, and what they're going to pass here, the Utah Territory's laws are going to be extremely liberal concerning slaves. Slaves needed to consent on being brought into the territory. So an individual couldn't just be in one part of the country and say, hey, I'm going to haul my slaves off to Utah and live happily ever after. The Utah Territory is actually going to give a voice to slaves brought into the territory. Owners also must provide food, clothing, shelter, and all other basic needs for these servants and slaves that are being brought into the territory. And that's followed up with the idea that neglect and abuse would lead to an end of the contract between master and slave. So this is giving a little bit of power that if there's a claim of abuse, that the slave's claim will be heard, and it can result in the end of the contract between master and slave. Also, we're going to see the anti-miscegenation ideas come into this document, because there's going to be a section where sex between master and slave is going to result in a fine and or jail time for the master themselves. And it's also followed up with the freeing of the slave involved in this situation. Slaves are also they're not going to be allowed to be passed on as property in terms of inheritance. So we really see, when we look at all of these really liberal claims in this document, the goal can be stated that they want to allow slavery. Yes, they're going to allow slavery to exist in Utah. That can't be debated. Why? Because before this point, Brigham Young and the Southern missions have had individuals come into the Utah Territory, and they've brought with them slaves that they have owned before moving to the territory. Therefore, before the territory is organized, there are slaves here. These individuals that came from the South are extremely wealthy. They're financially helping to support the church, and it would be horrible if Brigham Young were to end up losing the support of these individuals. Therefore, if he's to come out as a straight abolitionist or in any way against slavery, and he issues this document that says all slaves must be freed at this time, he would have lost the support and the financial assets of these Southern members. So this document here is really serving to keep the support of the Southerners that had joined the church and had brought their slaves into the territory itself. And there's only around 60 or so documented slaves at this time in 1852. So the number's quite small. So to lose the financial assets, Brigham Young deems it more important to allow slavery, to allow these individuals to keep their slaves in order to maintain their support for the church. But there's also a secondary goal here that we sort of see from Brigham Young, having Northern roots, being influenced by Joseph Smith. The goal with all of this, especially with the idea that you cannot inherit slaves and pass those down as property, and the consent required to bring new slaves into the territory, we're seeing here not too many slaves are going to consent to being a slave still coming into this territory. And when an owner dies, a slave is set free in the territory. Therefore, we're seeing that this document is also allowing for a controlled death of slavery in the territory itself. And this is really shown in an interview between Brigham Young and Horace Greeley. Horace Greeley asked Brigham Young the question of like, hey, so if Utah is going to be admitted as a territory, is it going to be a free place or a slave territory? And Brigham Young says, no, it's not going to be a slave territory. It's going to be a free place. And he does this in a really roundabout way. Again, being the orator that he is, he has to maintain a way to save face with the Southerners that are in the territory, but also stay true to his view that slavery is an abhorrent system. So he says slavery is supported due to biblical principles. Therefore, the slaves that are there, they're allowed to be in slavery, but the laws are written the way that they are. And Horace Greeley, he can read them if he wants to find out what Brigham Young actually thinks. But the laws are showing that Utah will be a free territory via the slow eradication of slavery as a system as it goes forward. So now we need to come back to the priesthood ban itself. We've talked a little bit about slavery here. So the priesthood ban, if we have slavery in the territory, why then do we need the priesthood ban? And again, rewinding a little bit, it's going to be February 5th, 1852, where Brigham Young is going to announce the racial priesthood ban. And he's going to end up explaining that, hey, there's a curse of Cain that has been on those of African descent since biblical times. And this is the reason that these individuals cannot hold the priesthood. So why? Why can't Africans hold the priesthood? Sure, this curse of Cain, it's prevalent in evangelical movements at this time, but it's also dying out on the East Coast for the most part. This explanation isn't holding weight anymore, but Brigham Young is really going to use this to back up his birthing of the priesthood ban. So I really want to focus in on a couple of authors that have written about the priesthood ban. First up, this here, Religion of a Different Color by Professor W. Paul Reeve. So he wrote about the priesthood ban, and I really drew on his work while I was writing my dissertation. I actually argued against it for some parts of my dissertation. And another important work, Second Class Saints by Matthew Harris. So both of these works really delve into the origins of the priesthood ban and why it lasted for 126 years. Specifically, Matt Harris talks about why it lasted for 126 years, while Paul Reeve is talking more about the origins of the priesthood ban. So Paul Reeve, I mentioned that I argued against his thesis in my dissertation. And Paul Reeve's viewpoint with his book here is that Mormons are trying to be whites and fit in. So by allowing slavery, they align themselves more with Southerners. They become more attractive for Southern slaveholders. And when slavery is going to be slowly eradicated, they can't appear to be friendly to African Americans, or they're going to lose that support of the South that holds this view that African Americans, slaves are not really human. They're subhuman. the dehumanization aspects of things. So Paul Reeve's viewpoint here is that the priesthood ban is created as a way to help Mormons fit in. Over time, they had been seen in Missouri as possibly too friendly to African Americans. The Book of Mormon holds that Native Americans have this biblical origin story where they're actually really important, another group that had been persecuted by Americans at this time. So with the Mormons being friendly with groups that are being seen as subhuman in comparison to white Americans, the Mormons had been ostracized and seen in their own ways as less than whites. So Paul Reeve is arguing that the priesthood ban is a way for them to essentially save face and say, hey, look, guys, hey, look, we also don't view Africans as equals to whites. Therefore, you can come to our church, feel free, you can convert to our religion, and know that you're not going to have to see these individuals as equal. If it's not legally, it will be spiritually. In many ways, the priesthood ban is saying that spiritually, there is something deeper than just skin color. There is something biblical and divine about the reasons why Africans are seen as less than whites. So why doesn't this work for me? I think it's a decent sociological experimental thought on this. And there's a certain thing that makes this not work for me. If Mormons were looking to fit in, and the priesthood ban is going to be seen as a way to fit in, there's something that happens later this same year in 1852. Oh, in the summer of 1852, the church leaders, Orson Pratt specifically, is going to give an address where he publicly admits that LDS members are practicing polygamy. So polygamy is viewed extremely negatively. The Nauvoo Expositor, it's one of the things that shows up in the Nauvoo Expositor that leads Joseph Smith to have the printing press destroyed. And it's something the church leaders had been hiding since Joseph Smith's practice of it in the Nauvoo period. So in 1852, when church leaders come out and admit the practice, they're ostracizing themselves even more. So if the priesthood ban was a way to fit in, why are they going to take a step backwards? If we look at the 1856 party platform for the Republicans identify the idea that there are two twin pillars of barbarism, those being slavery and those being polygamy. So the Mormons had bought into the slavery system, albeit in a very liberal manner where it would be eradicated over time, and they had followed that up with the priesthood ban. But they had also now started practicing openly the system of polygamy, leading themselves to be a target of a new political party and have it be called a twin pillar of barbarism. That doesn't appear to be a great plan in finding a way to fit into society at this time. So back to the question, why did Brigham Young then create the priesthood ban? If it's not to fit in, what is it? So my understanding of this through my research, through other research that I've read, combing through the primary sources and writing my own dissertation, I see that we've got issues of racism and fear of intermarriage or miscegenation. Women, when they came to Utah from either overseas or from the East, moving to Utah via pioneer treks, they're seeking priesthood holders. And what we're going to have an influx of women seeking priesthood holders and not enough white male priesthood holders. Therefore, if blacks were allowed to have the priesthood, when women, specifically mostly white women, are seeking priesthood holders due to the fact that they can enter into the celestial kingdom through the keys that are achieved through the priesthood, if a black man holds the priesthood, he is a valid marriage companion for a white female. And Brigham Young does not want that. Some of the earliest thoughts of Brigham Young, where he's really formulating this, is surrounding an individual named William McCary. William McCary questioning why Mormons treat him poorly because of the color of his skin. Brigham Young's quote is saying, "We care not about the color of the skin." But later on, Apostle Parley P. Pratt lets Brigham Young know that, hey, William McCary is actually practicing this form of spiritual wifery where he's entering into polygamous marriages, and he's saying, hey, the way that you do that is we have to have sex, and then we are united in a polygamous union, and you have access to all the keys of the kingdom. This really turns Brigham Young off towards the idea of the possibility that blacks and whites may marry, and really starts a train of thoughts that end up being the priesthood ban. Combine that with William Appleby writing him about his questions about Q. Walker Lewis's son, who is married to a white woman in the East Coast. And these things really start brewing in Brigham Young's head, where he's saying, hey, like, I want to be racially progressive, but I also don't want our religion to be a target because we are intermarrying, and that's just too much for society to accept at this time. Even if you're talking about northern abolitionists, largely we have anti-miscegenation laws in the northern states at this time as well. So intermarriage is something that's not going to be accepted by many individuals, no matter how liberal they are at this time. So by denying the priesthood to black men, Brigham Young is limiting the playing field. He's limiting the choices that white women have upon coming to the Utah territory. They can't marry a black man because he can't have the priesthood. Therefore, they have to marry white men. But the problem is, there are fewer white men than there are white women in the territory. Enter, later 1852, the summer of 1852, enter the admission that the Mormons are practicing polygamy. With it outwardly spoken to the people, now the women that may have thought that this was just a rumor or lies that got Joseph Smith murdered, these individuals now know that polygamy is out there, that polygamy is a valid practice for the LDS Church. So white men that already had a wife or secretly had many wives could now open up their homes and they could take on more wives. Therefore, they're limiting the playing field where more women are going to be seeking them, and by opening up marriages via polygamy, they're making it so they can marry more and more women, therefore limiting the prospects of intermarriage amongst Mormons, making them a little bit more acceptable to the wider public at this time. So recapping here, we've got the LDS Church, specifically Brigham Young, issuing a priesthood ban combined with the admission that polygamy has been being practiced and is openly being practiced now. These two things coming together in order to prevent intermarriage between whites and black members of the church. Thank you for tuning in today. Join me next time on The Great and Spacious Building. Be sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel if you aren't already, and I look forward to seeing you back here next week.